2. Revolt of 1857-2. Results of the mutiny. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 was suppressed with an iron hand, yet it produced far-reaching results. The most important political result of the Indian Mutiny was that the rule of the East India Company came to an end and the company's Indian Empire passed under the English crown. The Act of 1858 declared that India shall be governed by and in the name of the Queen. The company protested strongly against its extinction. It sent to the Crown a petition drafted by John Stuart Mill, but to no purpose. An Act for the Better Government of India was passed in August 1858 and the government of the Indo-British Empire was assumed by the Queen. All the treaties and engagements made by the company with the rulers of the Indian states were to be honored by the Crown. Renewal of these treaties was not compulsory. The Governor-General of India was to be called as such by the people of the directly administered territories, but he was to be called Viceroy so far as the rulers of the Indian states were concerned. The mutiny marks a striking change in the British policy towards Indian states. The policy of subordinate isolation was given up, and the policy of subordinate union took its place. Further annexation of the Indian states came to an end. The right of adoption and succession was assured to them. Every state was given a certificate of recognition. The doctrine of lapse was totally discarded. The rulers could have no mutual relations without the British mediation. A ceiling was fixed for the forces of the Indian states. The government promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of the state except in case of utter misgovernment. The princes who had been helpful to the British in the mutiny were awarded honorary titles and gifts of money and land. The Nizam of Hyderabad was given back some of his territory annexed in 1853. His debt of $500,000 was written off. 3. The rulers of Nepal, Gwalior, Bhopal, Baroda and Rajputana were amply rewarded. Many of them were created knights. Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the first Peshwa, was fighting for his title of Peshwaship. He ran to the jungles of Nepal never to return again. Thus, the title of Peshwaship came to an end. A similar fate met the house of the Mughals. With the death of Bahadur Shah extinguished the line of the emperors. With the transfer of all powers of the company to the crown, the forces of the company had also been transferred from the company's service to that of the crown. A portion of the British forces protested against this transfer as it had been effected without their consent. They demanded the discharge. Some cantonments at Allahabad, Meerut etc. made serious demonstrations and there appeared a danger of serious collisions. So, the government was forced to discharge all who desired so. This mutiny decreased the number of British armies by 10,000 soldiers. The difficulties of the Indian Mutiny and the White Mutiny necessitated a reconstruction of the army. The reconstruction which followed was based on two major changes. One was concerned with the future organization of the army while the other was related to the proportion between the Indian and the British troops. It was decided that this proportion should not exceed 2:1 and that the field and artillery should be exclusively in the hands of the Europeans. The question of the organization of the army gave rise to a controversy between the Indian and the home authorities. The local European troops and the king's forces were two wings of the European forces. While the Indian authorities wanted a majority of local European troops, then home authorities wanted to amalgamate the two. At last, the amalgamation was effected in 1860, which gave a good sense of solidarity to the British troops. Though the mutiny had been suppressed, yet it resulted in an alarming state of finances. The English had lost the goodwill of the Indian masses and the reorganization of the finances was not an easy job. This disorganization of the finances caused a burden to the Indian people. The Indian debt increased heavily and the viceroy was forced to seek the advice of experts on this point. The mutiny drew the interest and attention of the government from external affairs to internal development. It now began to think of ways and means for the internal reconstruction of India. The period from 1861 to 1899 is marked with an outstanding interest for the development of the administrative policy of the government. Though this policy always aimed at the reconstruction that could develop India into a storehouse for raw materials as well as a market for the manufactured goods, yet the period was comparatively calm. The control of the Secretary of State for India increased over the Indian affairs than it had been under the Board of Control. Red Sea Cable was installed in 1870 which brought London and Simla within a few minutes' reach of each other. One indirect effect of the Indian Mutiny was the rise of extremism in Indian politics. The excesses practiced during the mutiny created serious feelings of hostility between the Indians and the English which went as far as to influence the political thought of India. 4. The mutual estrangement between the two races led to an extremist attitude which manifested itself some years later. The rise of extremist parties in India was the result of this indirect effect of the Indian Mutiny. As mentioned above, the mutiny widened the gulf between the Indians and the Europeans. Mere change of rulers could not remedy it. The Indians now began to think with a vengeance about the plans and means of ending the British rule, though for the time being their hopes were dashed to the ground. On the other hand, the Englishmen began to hate the Indians still more. There was no hope of confidence being restored. The mutiny gave rise to a serious gulf between the Hindus and the Muslims. It was, in reality, due to the incitement by the English given to both the communities during the mutiny with a view to weakening their might. The Muslims had participated more keenly in the mutiny than the Hindus. Moreover, it was mostly the Hindu princes who had supported the British. The Sikhs of Punjab had conquered Delhi and Lucknow. Thus, the Muslims came to have a grudge against the Hindus. Though both the impressions were untrue, yet the gulf between the two went on widening. The English directly or indirectly encouraged this estrangement with a view to prolonging the domination over the region. The Muslim civilization and culture, which was the culture of the rulers, was progressing by leaps and bounds. But the new masters of India gave a setback to the Muslim civilization. Urdu was replaced by English and the Western civilization dominated. The Queen's Proclamation of 1858 was marked by an assurance of religious freedom and equal treatment to the Indians. It gave out a policy of justice, benevolence and religious tolerance and promised not to interfere in the religious beliefs or the modes of worship of the Indians. Significance of the revolt. For the British, it brought out the shortcomings prevalent in the British administration and army. Had the revolt not happened, these shortcomings would have never come to the forefront. For the Indians, the revolt imparted a major lesson to Indians to carry out the future course of freedom struggle. It brought out the future grievances of soldiers and the commoners. The atrocities committed by both sides during the revolt shocked the Indian intellectuals who were convinced not to take the route of violence in the future struggle against the British. The sacrifices made by commoners and leaders of the revolt kept on inspiring the masses. It fueled them with the idea of nationalism and new energy, which was ultimately tapped by Gandhi after 1920. Nature of the mutiny. Divergent views. British historians like K. Malleson, Trevelyan, Lawrence, Holmes have painted it as a mutiny, confined to the army which did not command the support of the people at large. Sir John Lawrence and Seeley thought it to be a sepoys mutiny and nothing more. 5. It is difficult to agree with Ler. Rees said that the revolt was a war of fanatic religionists against Christians. Some English historians led by T.R. Holmes popularized the view that the revolt of 1857 was a conflict between civilization and barbarism. Majumdar, 1963, has commented, on the whole, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the so-called First National War of Independence of 1857 is neither first, nor national, nor a war of independence. Sir James Outram and W. Tyler described the outbreak as the result of Hindu-Muslim conspiracy. It was a regional specific mostly concentrated to North India. Disunity among the Bengali middle class, Punjab, Prince. Sepoy mutiny and civil rebellion already happened earlier. Benjamin Disraeli, Chancellor of Exchequer, 1858, later PM in 1874-80, described it in the House of Commons in 1857, is it a military mutiny or is it a national revolt? V.D. Savarkar described it, a planned war of national independence, a war fought for Swadharma and Swaraj. Karl Marx 1857 described it as, what he, John Bull, considers a military mutiny is in truth a national revolt. Recent studies are inclined towards national revolt, though no concept of nation in modern sense. Unlike earlier peasant revolts, there was greater interconnection between the territories and the rebels were open to influence from outside areas. Common distaste for British rule brought them against the authority of the company and they became their target of attack and pitted against the same enemy. It was back to the old familiar order but not centralized Mughal rule. Decentralized political order of the 18th century. Provincial rulers with considerable autonomy. Mughals as the source of legitimacy. Search for alternative power. After the collapse of British rule, the rebel leadership wanted to restore the pre-British world of the 18th century. Culture of the court was restarted. Appointments were made for various posts. Planning was done to fight Britishers. Chains of command were laid down in the army. The administrative structures established by rebels initially aimed at meeting war demands. However, this rebel rule was short-lived. In Awadh, where the rebel lasted longest, plans of counter-attack were made. 6. Images of the revolt. There are very few records on the rebels' point of view proclamation, letters and notifications. Official accounts of colonial administration and military men left their versions in letters and diaries, autobiography and official histories. The changing British attitudes were evident through the innumerable memos and notes, assessments of situations. The stories of the revolt that were published in British newspapers and magazines narrated in gory detail the violence of the mutineers. The pictorial images were produced by the British and Indians, paintings, pencil drawings, cartoons, bizarre prints. Celebrating the saviors. British pictures provoke a range of different emotions and reactions. Represent British heroes who saved English and repressed rebels. Relief of Lucknow, painted by Thomas Jones Barker in 1859, it represents the siege of Lucknow by mutineers and celebrating the British victories by their heroes Campbell, Outram and Havelock. The gestures of the heroes, triumphant horses, damaged residency, and dead and injured on the ground emphasized the British power. The British paintings provide a sense among English that the time of trouble was past and the rebellion was over, the British were the victors. English women and the honor of Britain. The news of violence against women and children resulted in demand for revenge and retribution in Britain. The British government was asked for their protection and safety. Artists expressed their sentiments through visual representations of trauma and suffering. In Memoriam, painted by Joseph Noel Paton, depicts English women and children huddled in a circle, looking helpless and innocent, seemingly waiting for the inevitable dishonor, violence and death. Represents the rebels as violent and brutish without depicting them in the picture. In some images women were shown as heroic figures. For example in Ms. Wheeler's painting where she is seen defending herself against the sepoys at Kanpur. Also shows a woman's battle to save the honor of Christianity from a wider perspective, as the Bible is shown lying on the floor. 7. Vengeance and retribution. Visual representations and news about the revolt resulted in anger and shocks in Britain. It was seen for the justice and British honor the rebels were to be suppressed ruthlessly. An image depicts an allegorical female figure of justice with a sword in one hand and a shield in the other, expressing rage and desire for revenge. Innumerable pictures and cartoons were published in newspapers that sanctioned brutal repression and violent reprisal. The British Lion's vengeance on the Bengal tiger, and Justice, of Punch magazine were the famous images. The White Mutiny. It occurred in the wake of the 1857 revolt. The reasons for the mutiny. Before 1861 two separate military forces used to operate under the company's rule. One was the Queen's Army and the other the Army of the East India Company. The company troops used to receive batta or extra allowance when they served out of their home country. This batta was stopped with the transfer of power. This infuriated the white soldiers and they rose in revolt. No time for clemency. Lord Canning was mocked on suggesting to show mercy towards Indian sepoys for gaining their loyalty. The cartoons were published in the pages of Punch, a British journal. Image, The Clemency of Canning, shows Canning as a looming father figure protecting an Indian sepoy who still holds an unsheathed sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, both dripping with blood. Nationalist imageries. National movement, 20th century, draw inspiration from the events of 1857. 8. It was celebrated as the first war of independence in which all the sections of society came together to fight the foreign rule. Art and literature contributed in keeping alive the memory of 1857. Leaders of the revolt represented as heroic figures. Heroic poems were written. Rani of Jhansi represented a masculine figure chasing the enemy. Khub Lari Mardani Wo to Jhansi Wali Rani Thi, famous lines. Written by Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. She is portrayed as the symbol of the determination to resist injustice.